Good evening. Welcome to Arts at UNH, where we interview writers that come to our reading series here at the University of New Haven. I'd like to welcome you all today. Our guest today is Tyehimba Jess, and I would just read you a little bit of Tyehimba's bio. Tyehimba is a Detroit native. His first book of poetry, Leadbelly, was a winner of the 2004 National Poetry Series. The Library Journal and Black Issues Book Review both named it one of the best poetry books of 2005. Jess, a Covey Conem and a New York University alumni, received a 2004 Literature Fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts and was a 2004-05 Winter Fellow at the Provincetown Fine Arts Works Center. Jess is also a veteran of the 2000 and 2001 Green Mill Poetry Slam team and won a 2000-2001 Illinois Art Council Fellowship in Poetry. Jess is an assistant professor of English at College of Staten Island. We'd like to welcome Tyehimba Jess. Welcome, man.
Thank you for bringing me out.
Good to have you here. Good to have you here. First of all, I want to get into the book Leadbelly, which sort of has become a seminal book within literature. I like to think that within the landscape of American literature. Talk about sort of, and we've been looking at that book in our class, Intro to Creative Writing, and the Forums class. So it would be interesting. My students wanted to know. So what was the genesis for that project, the Leadbelly, which is a sort of an historical project, correct?
Yeah. I guess the genesis was that I've always been a lover of the blues.
Right.
And Leadbelly is not exactly a blues player, so to speak. He was not exactly. He was more located in the folk tradition than he was in the blues tradition. But he's kind of like a cornerstone that in American folk music that branches off into blues, so to speak.
Right.
So I read a book called The Life and Legend of Leadbelly by, I think his name is Kip Kelly. I can't remember exactly his name right now. But it was a very, straightforward, well-written book about lead. And what I just started to write these poems about lead, and the first one that was written was when he was being chased after a prison escape, and he went into the Red River, and a dog followed him, and he drowned the dog, and the sheriff was like that close to shooting him.
Right.
So. And so it just kind of grew and grew and grew after that. And to make a long story short, what I discovered about his life, which was roughly 1885 to 1949, is that it covered so many different themes: African-American relationship to prison-industrial complex,
Exactly.
To the recording industry, anthropology, the Great Migration. There was a love story involved in it. There was this internal struggle that he had in order to gain control over his temper and his anger, in order to control himself and control his music and his destiny. Right. And I think that that was all of those things combined, and also the idea that he's a person located just at the edge of myth and fact. A lot of people.
Right, the intersection of myth and fact, almost like a Robert Johnson in
right.
that way, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, people had these, and I had these misconceptions about Leadbelly that I really wanted to figure out how true they were, and I really wanted to ground the book in the actual historical fact as much as I possibly could.
I can remember actually reading that book, and I remember the historical facts in it was sort of, and I tell my students, part of it is teaching you. You're getting the best of creative writing, and you're getting this history lesson at the same time. And one of the things I want to say, while working in persona, for those out there in the audience who don't know, persona is when the writer or the author assumes the voice of someone else. At what point did you sort of feel like, yeah, I got Leadbelly's voice? Because I know there's always a moment, I think, because when I was working in persona, I remember that moment, or that when I began to feel close to what I was doing, like I was all in then.
Yeah, originally the entire book was just going to be in Leadbelly's voice. And then after about 20, 30 poems in, I was like, I thought that I needed to break off, and so I started doing objects and people around him.
Right.
But there was a point where where I had to kind of step back and say, okay, how much of this there's this suspension of disbelief that happens when you're reading the poems, and in that, you know, what you're hearing is the voice of what Leadbelly might have been thinking at a particular time, and I'm trying to lend it a certain degree of authenticity without stretching, like, you know, the vocabulary too far out of what might have been his supposed range, and remaining true to his character, so to speak.
I think you do that.
So
I mean, it reminds me, I look at Zora Neale Hurston's book. I don't know if you've ever heard Every Tongue Gotta Speak.
yeah,
And it's sort of like, sort of the guy to that vernacular that, so that's one of the things when you're in persona, you always got to stay true to the time,
right,
the language,
right,
but still make it believable and make it real,
right.
Yeah.
So it involved a lot of research and just trying to, there were times I had to, okay, bring it back, Jess, bring it back just a little bit, just a little too tangled up,
Right.
And then other times where I feel like I got it. So it was always a balancing act,
Yeah. And I know one of the things, I just real before we move on, the idea of titles, and for young creative writers, I can actually remember this, me and you were dialoguing about my manuscript, and one of the things I remember you talking about is being clear in your titles, and your titles have to sort of tell the story. How did you come about? I mean, how does that work for you? I mean, because I think you do it really well. Because I tell people all the time, if you look at the titles, it sort of tells you can get a narrative within that itself, right?
I think that the way I looked at titles, particularly for Leadbelly, was to solve a certain problem, which was to locate the reader at a certain time, a certain place, and to kind of get an idea of the tone of what was going to happen. So that therein is where I developed my idea about what the function of title should perform. If we're a different book,
right,
it would be a different scenario.
Right, but I just thought, for that you needed the time, you needed the clarity,
right,
of what was happening, who was speaking, what was going on.
Exactly, because there's really specific things that are happening, and then the section titles as well were based off of songs,
right,
of his. Okay. So I wanted to be to involve as much of him into the project as I possibly could.
Okay, very good. Now I want to sort of segue into your latest project, which is Olio, right?
Yes.
Before we get there, I want to talk about you just recently did a TED Talk in Nashville, which I found very interesting, very informative, and it's based on the McCoy sisters. I was wondering, could you tell our audience a little bit about that, and how did you sort of come into that, but also the syncopated sonnets and that whole idea.
Well, the McCoy sisters, to start off, were conjoined twins. They were joined back to back, roughly, and they were born, I want to say, 1849, 1850 or so, in slavery, in North Carolina, and they were their master resolved that the best way that he was going to make a profit off of them was to put them rent them out on a freak show circuit at the age of around 2 or so. And so they were circulated on this freak show circuit in which they were, every time they went to a new town, they were inspected, anatomically inspected, over and over and over and over and over again. Yeah. And then they were kidnapped, taken to England, and one of the other co-leasers, because they were rented out in a couple of different ways. One of the other co-leasers went to England with their mother over to England, got them, and brought them back. And at that time, slavery had been abolished in England, and the mother had to make the decision as to whether or not she was going to stay with them or go back home to the United States. She came back, brought them home.
Which is an interesting thing within itself.
It is. Very difficult decision to make. And later on, after the Civil War, when they gained their emancipation, they continued on the freak show circuit, but under their own terms. In other words, they had an affidavit that explained that they actually were conjoined twins and that they no longer had to go through these inspections, so to speak. And so they they gained a certain degree of agency over themselves,
Right,
and
right.
became really big stars.
Right, right,
So, my in writing about them, I wanted to express the kind of that conjoinedness and that unique voice that they had. So what I tried to do was to develop. I worked with sonnets because I wanted to work with a kind of poetic form that they would have been more familiar with. In other
right.
words, sonnets were really big
Yeah,
in the 19th
exactly.
century, and exact
Exactly.
sonnets.
Exactly.
A B A B C D
Right.
C D E F
Right,
F
right,
G
right,
G,
right, right.
and so I had previously done some work around a gentleman named Blind Tom, and while writing these syncopated sonnets, is what I just decided to call them, was two sonnets side by side that talk to each other
Right.
and run back and forth,
Right.
and you have one persona on one side and the other persona on the other side. I kind of had a revelation working with those, and and that was probably when the idea, because I kind of knew about the McCoy twins, but when I discovered that I could make a sonnet that spoke back and forth, I thought, well,
Right.
they're
And I
perfect.
just want to preface this for our viewers that you had previously worked sort of like that with the contrapuntal and lead belly,
Yes.
assuming Lomax's and lead belly's voices and sort of intertwining
Yes.
those with, with letters and things like that. So,
Yeah. So I had done some work like that in Lead Belly, but I wanted to really what I really decided I wanted to really explore it as far as I knew how to explore the idea of contrapuntal poems, and so that's what I did. I developed a kind of a a a form that's a contrapuntal sonnet, syncopated sonnet, and then I developed their story within, using the concept of a crown of sonnets,
right.
which forms a circle, and instead forming something that looks kind of like an X, where the two, you can imagine the head and the feet of each sister
Right.
on either side.
Right.
So, and you can read the story down and up and all the way through, whichever direction you choose to travel. And I think that sometimes ideas come out of desperation.
Tell me about
You
it.
know, you're desperate,
You gotta
and you're
find
thinking, how am I going
right.
to make
Yeah.
this? How
Yeah.
am I going to tell these folks' story? How am I going to make this original to them?
It's
And
interesting. That's where it always starts. It most always starts out like that. And sometimes, and then you
Right.
sort of figure it out as you go. You know?
Right, right.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. But yeah, and I say, and so that sort of segues into your latest project or the latest book that will be coming out sometime in the near future. But it's almost complete. And I've had a chance to read with you, and I've seen, you read plenty of times of some of the things that's going on. So for the viewers that don't know, talk about what oleo necessarily means, and then go into the idea of what this book is about, because it deals with persona as well.
Yeah. Well, oleo, aside from in the Italian meaning oil, means was the middle part of a minstrel show.
Right.
In that it was the variety act of the minstrel show, and later on, when the minstrel show was essentially the major form of entertainment in the 19th century. So, for those not familiar, minstrel show was in the American sense was a form of entertainment where white folks would put on blackface
Right.
and perform caricatures of black people, and then it was popular starting early part of the 19th century, all the way really up until the middle part of the 20th century, more or less. And after emancipation, it's the development was that more and more black people started to get involved in minstrelsy and with dark face and without dark face, etc. But the oleo was the middle part. It was a variety show, so different kinds of acts would come on: musical acts, theatrical acts,
Right.
contortionists, et
Right.
cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what I wanted to do was to have a multitude of voices in the oleo, but telling their own story in a way that lent them dignity beyond the minstrel show trope of their period. So I have Blind Tom, famous piano player, Blind Boone, another famous piano player, Scott Joplin, who's
Right.
considered more or less the father of ragtime, the McCoy twins, Sissy Retta Jones, first sister to sing in Carnegie Hall, really a little bit before it was Carnegie Hall. Harry Burley is another person I've worked with who may or may not be in the book. That's a question. Yeah, let me see. I'm forgetting all the the Fish Jubilee Singers.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Let me see. I'm probably forgetting a couple of people.
But you make a good point, and I just want to interject this for people, the young folks who are beginning to write and consider themselves writers. I'm almost sure that you just didn't, that you had to sit down and sort of research these people. You had to
Definitely,
figure out what
yes.
they do, and so it becomes this sort of thing where you're learning too.
Exactly.
You
Yeah.
can't you can't write about these things if you don't know about them, and you have to do the research. And that's the thing about it. It took you how long to do Lead Belly?
That was 5 years.
Right. Right.
5 year
Yeah.
journey.
So, I mean, projects just don't happen, and so that's what I wanted to sort of hone in on it. That anything worth anything is going to take a little time, and you have to put the time into it. So,
Right.
But you got all these characters, man. And,
Right. And I just think the other part of that is that we often think about Black American music, et cetera, and Black entertainment, but we are used to thinking of the entertainment that we have recorded either sonically or visually, and none of these people were recorded in that fashion. In other words, there are no audio recordings of Blind Boone or Blind Tom or or Sissy Retta Jones or any of these people.
word of mouth,
Yeah,
newspaper,
etc. Now there might be some player piano recordings of Blind Boone and Scott Joplin,
right,
but that's about it.
Gotcha.
The rest of them, there's. But what I'm really interested in is what was happening in the music before blues and jazz were marketed as such. You know what I'm saying?
Wow, yeah.
So you're talking, blues really wasn't marketed as blues until the 20th century. Same with and jazz wasn't really marketed as jazz until the 20th century. Really,
Probably
the teens.
Yeah, that's what I was getting ready to say.
Really about
before-
100 years ago,
Yeah,
roughly.
right before the Harlem Renaissance, you
Right.
started seeing the beginnings of jazz a little bit. What they calling it jazz in that
They're
way.
calling it jazz, etc.
Right.
Before that, you have ragtime, you have
There you go.
coon songs.
Right, but sort of, that sort of leads itself up to the jazz and
Right,
that mix.
exactly,
Right.
exactly. So that really intrigued me, and I felt a little ignorant in that I had no real knowledge
Right.
of
yeah.
what was going on post Civil War up until around 1917, which is the area that I'm dealing with.
Right.
And so all of these characters kind of started to poke their heads out and at me and say, "Hey, what's up?" And so I wanted to listen to them and I've wanted to try and capture their story in some kind of way.
Well, man, you're the best person for the job.
Well, thank you, man.
Tyehimba, Jess, I want to thank you for coming to RC UNH. The first
Thank
book
you.
is Lead Belly. The second one is Oleo. You can go to YouTube and hear Tyehimba's TED Talk in Nashville. I want to thank our audience for tuning in to RC UNH. And the next time you'll see us, we'll have sitting right here Martina Spada, the founders for the Pulitzer Prize and the Latino poet of his generation. Thank you so much. All right.